Okay, we on? We're on. Good, 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 good. We're up here fighting over drinks. I just discovered that Doc is teaching this morning. So we'll see you all. I'm out of here. Thank you, Doc. You'll have wished by the time I get through. Well, we're wrapping up. Oh, he took it off of there. So you don't understand my, it doesn't say it anymore. It did say Doc was up there teaching a minute ago. Somebody's been changing things on me. Uh, well, we're going to wrap up our class today on Spirit in the Old Testament. Uh, it has been an adventure for us. I hope that it's been meaningful to you and hopefully encouraging. Uh, I've said, I think Doc's going to mainly review some of the stuff that he's covered, and that's what I plan to do. Just go over some things that we've already covered, but just try to summarize. And said this before, but for me, when I started into this whole idea, I could have maybe come up with a half a dozen passages with Spirit in the Old Testament. Well, actually, I knew that there were a lot of passages in Judges, Samuel. The Spirit came upon. The Spirit came upon. That was my main reference, other than the first, the Spirit hovering over the waters in Genesis. And I knew, and I had read, like many of the passages that have to do with the promise of the Spirit coming, but I really hadn't given it much thought in terms of the Spirit in the Old Testament. Never really looked a lot, just focused on that like we have. And it's just been interesting to me, and like I say, encouraging. It always is when you dig into Scripture. You find these passages that are just so powerful that maybe hadn't noticed before. But what I wanted to think about for a few minutes this morning on my part is think about the ways that you've heard the Spirit described, or you see it him described in the Old Testament, and the way he works in the Old Testament. And want to try something maybe a little rhetorical, if that's the right word. But think about, why did God choose to reveal those particular things to the Jews and to us? And to start with, we're going to start with Genesis 1-2 in a second. And I think you'll see how that maybe applies. But I've put a little summary of passages, as you can see on the handout, if everyone has it. I've broken it into just a few verses based on the sections that we broke down for each class: the Pentateuch, the books of history, books, poetry, prophets. And there's about 80 passages that refer to the Spirit of God. Now, I've found some that will say around 60, some that will say around 100, just for myself, and just going through. I found around 80, and I've only listed about 30. And today's handout, I did something different. I didn't include any passages about that were focused on ruach, where it's translated as breath or wind. These are the ones, just some of the ones that are focused on the Spirit of God. So kind of narrowing the focus there. And then what I want to do is just go through a few things that stood out to me in each section, and then see maybe what stood out to you. Maybe it was there or somewhere else. But I want to come back first with this Genesis 1-2. The Spirit hovered over the water. The earth was without form and void. The darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of waters. Those of you who are here might remember when I was looking into this, I found out that the word for hover is something called Rockoff, or one of those kind of, Worf type words from Star Trek. But now, I didn't discover this. I discovered it for me. Other people know this because it was pointed out to me, and I did a little research, and sure enough, it looks true. It's only used twice in Scripture, but it wasn't an uncommon term in ancient Jewish literature, just an everyday use. And in the other passage, I'm going to read it from Deuteronomy 32. He, meaning God, found him, meaning Israel, in a desert land and in the howling waste of the wilderness. He encircled him. He cared for him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them in his pinions, the Lord alone guided him, Israel. That word flutters is rakaf, is hovers. It's the only other place it's used in scripture. And the word literally means brood. And I was telling Carolyn on the way here, I have a hard time using that word because I think of somebody brooding, which I'm pretty good at, soaking. That's. But those of you who have been around the country, which I haven't, you probably have another view of that word. When a hen broods over it, chicks, an eagle broods over its. Anyway, in this passage. And one thing I was thinking about, it's just interesting to me that God didn't just say the Spirit hovered over the waters. He picked this word out that for centuries and centuries and thousands of years, and I'll just start with the Jews, every time someone heard this word, this story of creation about the God of the universe, they would hear about his Spirit brooding over creation, brooding over the waters. And instead of just this idea of being over, I just wonder if every one of them didn't think, wow, the God of the universe is protecting, however you want to define that, nurturing, sheltering his creation, his people. Just what a neat thing that I had never thought of. So then we move on to Judges and Samuel, and we could spend a lot of time on this. Like I said, I had always focused on the Spirit came upon Gideon or whoever, all these different judges and kings. But as we went through this, I discovered quite often it doesn't just say come upon, it says rushed upon pretty often, or clothed is used a number of times, or stirred. The Spirit stirred Samuel. And we talked about that one being literally tapping. And I loved Karen's, hi Karen, by the way, Karen Strong's thought about that was it made her think of a pebble in your shoe. Every time you walk, you'd be reminded. So you've got the Spirit who is described as coming on with all of this power, and suddenly, that's the image was rushed upon. And then you've got clothed, which, how do you define that? Literally means to wrap around or protect. And then you've got to stir, which can mean to agitate, which I suppose a pebble would agitate you, but like a constant reminder, which we talk a lot about, I think, as Christians, about how the Spirit, we felt like the Spirit was prompting us to do something, and then we ignored it, and we keep getting prompted, sometimes hit over the head, and we keep, So you've got this gamut here, and mix that in with hover, just those verbs. And then we've got what stood out to me. I'm going to leave a little bit of time for everybody. In Job and Psalms, which I never thought about the Spirit in Job before this class, but I'm going to read a passage out of Psalm 143, where he says, "Let your good Spirit lead me on level ground." Just notice the closeness here. "Let the morning bring me word of your unfailing love." And if I can turn my page, I'll continue. "For I have put my trust in you. Show me the way I should go, for to you I entrust my life. Rescue from my enemies, Lord, for I hide myself in you. Teach me to do your will, for you are my God. May your good Spirit lead me on to level ground." And just that picture, and all through Psalms, the Psalm 51, which we won't get into now, just the intimacy David has when talking about the Spirit, the intimacy that he's craving. And then how do you wrap up the prophets? But a couple points, and I put it on your outline, that really stood out to me were it's just almost impossible to study the Spirit of God in the Old Testament and not get all wrapped up in all the prophecies the Messianic and the New Covenant, the promise of the Spirit coming upon everyone. And you can see I highlighted those in just a few in red on your handout, but you can see how many there are. If you look at just the red bolded on my handout, there's what, 15, 20 that are all wrapped up in the Spirit. And then, well, this is a little bit of sidetrack. It's the Ezekiel and God's glory. For those of you who are a part of that study, just the way I've never gone looking to Ezekiel. I think I'll sit down and study Ezekiel today. Maybe you do. You do your daily Bible reading. You go through it, but it hasn't been something that I've been drawn to. But going through Ezekiel and just seeing that, how the glory of God is just portrayed all the way through Ezekiel, and how the Spirit of the Lord is right there when it's describing in chapter 1 this huge chariot, if you want to call it that, with flames and brightness and all this power and all these eyes looking everywhere and wheels. The Spirit is the one that's driving it. It says wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went, referring to the creatures, the angels that were leading it. That, I just thought that was neat. And then in let me not forget. And then in Ezekiel, the promise in the Valley of the Dry Bones. I guess I'd really never looked at the context of that one before. I knew that story, but the context of this judgment in Ezekiel, because they'd strayed so far, and just where the people were at that point, because they turned from God and being in exile. And then God, and in Ezekiel, the last half of it or so, last third, deals with this promise of a new Jerusalem and what that's going to be like. And in the midst of that is the promise, return to me and I will pour my Spirit upon you, upon Israel. And then in Joel, the one with the locust. Anybody remember the locust? Anyway, one of my favorite scenes there. You have just this description of absolute devastation with these locusts. And it's not just one type of locust coming through. It's these locusts come through, and then another type wipe out everything that's left. And then another type comes through, and they wipe out what's left. And it's not a good picture. And whether it's a parable or factual or whatever, whichever, it's just power. This is just, Joel is describing where the people are at and how lost they are and how devastated they are. And in the middle of it, you have this passage to me that he tells them in Joel 2, return to me and I will restore to you the years of the swarming locust. And he goes on to say, you will pray and you will praise the name of the Lord your God, and you will know that I am in the midst of Israel and that I am your Lord, the Lord your God. And then it goes on to say, and I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh, on your sons and your daughter, and your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out of my Spirit in those days. And that's what we find in Acts 2, the one that we refer to a lot when we think about the Spirit. So these are some of the things that stood out to me. Whether it's from something I mentioned or something else that you saw. Just a few minutes about what pictures come to your mind when you think of the Spirit in the Old Testament from these verses or others. How would you, just one word, one or two words? I've given you a few here. Cover? Covers you? Great. Carrie said covers for online. Great. Anyone else? Michelle? The hand of the Spirit. Wow. And what made you think of that particular phrase? Just came to mind.
Just how many times that was used in, the lesson that you taught about that. Okay. I guess I'd never seen that before.
Okay. Thank you. We have 3 more minutes and then it's Doc's turn. So you got to. I just want to read a few and then throw up your hand if you think of something. Protection, shelter, power, guidance, intimacy. These are just some that hope. Spirit brings hope, restoration, renewal. And I guess the question I'm going to leave for my part is, because it's a question when I first started into this, how is the spirit of the Old Testament different or like the spirit we talk about in the New Testament? And we know God's the same. I'm not saying that he changes, but in terms of how God reveals him in the Old Testament. Carolyn? You got a mic coming.
One of the words, I was too slow to get on the last discussion, but presence. And I love this verse in Psalm 139, where shall I go from your spirit? And where shall I flee from your presence? So he's everywhere and always.
Thank you. I should have included that one. Yes. It is on there? Carrie, you look like you have, oh, you have the mic. You're already.
A word that's come to me this week on a very personal way is I'm not alone. Because Spirit's there
Spirit's
with
with
me.
you.
So nothing to fear.
So do not fear. Thank you. Lauren? Oh, I'm sorry, Mona.
Yeah, I feel that the spirit, when the spirit moves on you, you can trust and feel comforted. It comforts.
Gives confidence and comfort. Thank you. Lawrence? Now that you have a donut.
It seems to me that as it's presented in the old book, that the Spirit comes on specific individuals at specific times for specific purposes. And yet his promise to pour out his Spirit to all flesh in that day, which is our day, means that when we are baptized and we are given the gift of the Spirit, it's for then on, for everyone, not just a few that have a specific task.
A fulfillment of the promise. Yeah.
Dave?
I thought I saw Scott. Nope.
Dave?
I think it's just two quick points and I'm done, but it was just interesting to me how the Spirit works all through the Old Testament in ways that are familiar to us as Christians. I mean, that we talk about regularly. I mean, it is true what Lauren's saying. God seemed to put his Spirit on individuals more than over whole groups, although there are groups that he put his Spirit on. His Spirit came over the 70. And there's places where you could interpret it where he says, you know, I'll put, my Spirit's going to come upon Israel. And it's talking about current events. Some people interpret those that way. So, I mean, that's there. But just how this, when early Christians received the Spirit, the idea wouldn't have been a new thing. It's something that they had grown up hearing about. And I would imagine if you could imagine that it was only for these people that you've heard about, these people that you've held up and you've studied through the years, to think about God's going to anoint me in the same way. God has anointed me in the same way. That's pretty incredible. Pretty incredible. So anyway, thank you for going through that. Doc's got some good stuff he's going to lead us through. And I want to thank Doc again for joining in and working on this. It's always fun. We haven't had as much time. We were joking this morning. We got to see each other and said we actually got to talk about class for 2 minutes. But anyway, thank you. Oh, I got to give you El Mico.
Yeah, change of the guard here. In looking at this, we're trying to figure out what to kind of go over at the end. Like we were trying to go over all the stuff going, where to begin in this. And I was going to kind of just hit highlights. Dave has done the majority of work on all this class. So, yeah, I appreciate the stuff that he has done. My initial thoughts, I think, on kind of a review is, when we first looked at this, the idea of Ruach, David, talked about how, the translation, of course, is breath, wind, or spirit. And you think of that. We've heard that over and over and over. But the main point of that is, what's that associated with? What are those words associated with in the Bible and the Old Testament? And they're all either some type of power, some type of movement, some type of life, the essence of life. And it's not, the spirit is not passive at all. Even in hovering, even in shadow, there's movement, there's energy, there's power, there's protection, there's something being given. And so I never really had thought about, the spirit as always being literally active throughout the whole Old Testament. Then, in studying all of this, looking at, Israel's really tumultuous relationship with God ever since, Moses came in and said, "Hey, let's go," and they go, "Really?" Yeah, they've had issues all the way through until really Christ. And you're sitting here looking at Israel, and you've got, cloud by day, fire by night. You've got mountains rumbling. You've got, tabernacle being, God coming down, and they still can't seem to get it together. And so one of the themes that seems to be all the way through is they confused closeness to being surrendering. So the message was with the Spirit, don't confuse being close to the Spirit and God with surrendering to the Spirit and God. And that's a theme all the way through. They think they're close. They think they're this, or think they've got this. The Pharisees even continue that. Hey, we're close to God. Look at us. But they never surrendered. They were just the epitome of the whole Old Testament theme. Then another theme that came through was, we do not use the Spirit. The Spirit uses us. And it's emphatic when you start looking at the main people. We looked at Bezalel last week, how he was, his name is a shadow of God. He's been kind of that epitome of the shelter, the protection. He's the one that builds the tabernacle with the power of the Spirit. He's used by the Spirit. He got Balaam. Balaam's called from Balak to, "Hey, I want you to curse these Israelites. I don't want them to come around." And he gets ready, and he gets ready to curse them. And he can't, because the Spirit comes on him. And he gets to, just announce all these blessings and what's going to happen to Israel. And it's like he's used. And then you've got the judges, Samuel And then do you remember the story of Abigail and how she was used by the Spirit to calm David down? And you got Isaiah, the prophets, the apostles, us. We cannot confuse closeness to surrender. And I know that many times I've done that. I'm close to God. I'm good. I'm there. He and our buds. Yeah, we got it worked out. I hear that too often also. And then there's Nicodemus. I got infatuated with Nicodemus. Because the conversation that Christ has with him is, how come you don't understand the Spirit? How come you don't understand what was in the Old Testament? How come you don't understand the promise that was set up from the Spirit in the Old Testament? How come you don't get that? And what Christ has illustrated him and Luke, when he wrote it down to us, is the idea that there's just a spiritual blindness that you have. And that sets the stage. Really, we'll get to it in a second, in Matthew, where you have Sermon on the Mount. But Christ is telling Nicodemus, you don't understand, the creative, the redemptive, the regenerative power of the Spirit. You don't get it. You just stay in this physical, what can I do? Or you think that the physical aspect of what you do is going to give you and lead you to the kingdom. It's not. And you have the Old Testament where the Spirit's trying to help create the kingdom of Israel so that they could be a light of the world. Then you have Christ coming in saying, okay, this is where the promise of the Spirit comes in, to where we're going to have a real spiritual kingdom that will be the light of the world. And that's kind of one of the ways that I got infatuated with Nicodemus and the Spirit in the Old Testament. My second class dependent, and third class, basically, handouts. You got handouts. I don't know if you got delve into them or read them yet. That's fine. Anybody listening to this on, the website, Jen's going to make sure that all those handout links are open, so you don't have to request permission. You should be able to open them up and look at them. Does anybody have any questions on any of those handouts that you looked at? There were a lot, so don't worry about it. And really today, Christ talked about Nicodemus, or talked with Nicodemus about spiritual blindness. And that's something that the Israelites had all the way through their relationship, was the blindness of who they were, what their position was, who was this entity that they kept on realizing through the prophets and through other things that this is a God that is the God of Israel. You see that in David and Goliath. Who is this person who sits back and talks against our God, this God of Israel? Why aren't you people incensed about that he's talking against our God like he is? And he's asking, why don't you guys have the awe of God the way that I have, the way that it should be? In Matthew 5, Jesus gives a Sermon on the Mount, and he's talking about, here's a new way of living in a new kingdom that you guys don't even know about. You guys haven't figured out yet that this is the promise from Ezekiel. This is the promise from Isaiah. If you listened, if you really knew, like with Nicodemus, if you studied, you're supposed to be a teacher of law. Don't you understand that this promise is coming? It was here. And Matthew, after the Sermon on the Mount, he comes back and he gives these little nuggets. And it's kind of like these nuggets build up to the treasure in heaven, because he goes giving to the needy, the Lord's Prayer, fasting. And then he gets to this idea of treasure in heaven. And I'm going to read Matthew 6:21 through 24. That's for where your treasure is. You've heard this. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. This one I hadn't noticed until reading this. The eye is the lamp of the body. Anybody remember last week? The eye, the lamps. You got the menorah. You've got the 10 virgins and their lamps. So the eye is the lamp of the body. So if your eye is healthy, your whole body will be full of light. Again, think of the 10 virgins. They've got their oil. Some didn't have enough oil. So, what was the lamp of their eye? Where was it fixed? Where was it? Where was it? So if your eye is healthy, your body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your body will be full of darkness. If then the light in you is darkness, and I haven't figured that one out yet. If the light in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? It says, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You could not serve God and mammon. This text is, uses the metaphor of heart, eyes, lightness, and darkness. You've got that in Ezekiel. You've got that in Isaiah. You've got these things all throughout the Old Testament with the Spirit being part of that. Changing at the heart, changing, that rock heart to a new heart David wants. The lightness that's there. Going back to Genesis, it's all there. It's kind of amazed about it. But again, Jesus is talking here, Matthew has Jesus talking about spiritual blindness. If you don't have the light of your eye, or the lamp of your eye, focused, where's your treasure? Where are you looking for? Mammon is not just, it's like either money or possessions, is the way it's annotated in your Bible. But basically, it's anything that's not God. Anything that goes against God, anything that's counter against God, anything that takes you away from God. If we focused on that, hey, I'm a pharmacist, I'm prestigious, I've got this position, I've got this, I've got that. What do we have our eyes set on? Where's that lamp? What's it burning for? And in a way, what's it being purified for? For myself or for God? Let me come back. Okay. Yeah, I've got our spiritual eyesight, which is our light. It is directly related to what we treasure and whom or what we serve. So in looking at this and looking at the Old Testament, Israel's case, they always had an issue of who do I serve? Is it Elijah going with the prophets of Baal and the Asherah worshipers, the priest? You've always got some tension between Israel would be there for a while with God, and then they would just so easily lose focus and start looking at something else, and they would just lose their focus on God, and everything would fall apart. Then they come back. You've got that in Judges over and over. You got that in the prophets over and over. They're not looking at keeping that spirit, that light burning within them, and they lose that. They lose that flame. That's why I like that story of Abigail and Nabal. It's reflected in the 7 parts of the Spirit that Isaiah has written out. But Christ says you can either serve God or Mammon. You've got Abigail. I will choose to serve for her. David. My Lord. You've got Nabal showing the opposite of that. So you've got that story really is a good juxtaposition of what Jesus is saying here at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Who are you going to serve? How are you going to do it? I like movies and my geekiness. How many have ever seen Joe versus the volcano? You probably are going, what is that? It's an old movie from 1989, 1990, something like that. It's a campy movie. It beats you over the head with metaphors. But so much of it is so right and so true. Because when you look at it and just don't try to be critical of the movie, just kind of go with it. You see it. And there's one line where he's having a philosophical conversation with Meg Ryan, who plays 3 different personalities, 3 different people. But anyway, and it's kind of the whole essence of the movie, which is the idea of personal growth, the idea of changing, transformation. That Romans 12:2. And it's kind of the theme of the movie and the theme of this statement, of that what Christ is saying. And the quote is, she says, "My Father says that almost the whole world is asleep. Everybody you know, everybody you see, everybody you talk to. He says that only a few people are awake, and they live in a state of constant, total amazement." To me, that's living in the Spirit. To live in that constant, total amazement of what we have. The blessings we have, the life we have, the promise we have. Because that's one of the things with the Spirit in the Old Testament is you've got the power that you see in Genesis and it goes through. You got the presence all the way through with the Israelite formation and creation and that kingdom. And then at the end, you got Ezekiel where you've got the promise that comes in. It's kind of the 3 Ps, power, presence, promise. And it's all culminated. David was talking about how does this go into the New Testament. It's all culminated within Christ giving the Spirit to us to indwell in us, not to be on us, but to be in us, totally in us. So we have that power, that presence, that promise. We don't have to worry about it. And one of the things that in that first lesson, I didn't really know how to approach this, and Luann was able to ask me a few questions and get things organized in my mind. And one of the questions that she asked was, when all of this is done, what do you want to have accomplished? What's there? And I think it's just knowing that the Spirit is much, much more than I've ever imagined. We never studied this growing up. I never studied this growing up. And it's just more than I've ever imagined. And I think it's pretty cool because it's just like, wow. There really is a constant from the beginning to the end in the Bible. It really is there. And we looked at it in the concept of the oil, the light of life. Like I said, I understand the idea of constant total amazement because now there's too much, just a lot there. Dave, do you have anything you want to add? Oh. Scott starts in 2 weeks. Cool. Okay. Yeah. Do y'all have any thoughts, any questions, anything? No. Well, let's close out with a quick prayer. Father, your power, your presence, and your promise to us is we don't understand it. But even though we don't totally understand it, we know that it is there. We know there's evidence. We know that within us, we have your calm, your peace, your life. And it's just almost being giddy with awe and wonder and respect. Because God, you are an awesome God. And you reign in heaven and you love us. And what more could we ever want? Because that is our treasure. Okay, let us take this and let's go learn some more, Father. Guide us. Help your Spirit mold us, transform us, and give us greater understanding. In your Son's name, amen.